In the bleak heart of a Richmond winter, the kind that clung to the bones and froze breath midair, two men arrived at the gates of the Medical College of Virginia, identical in face, posture, and unsettling presence. Thomas and Timothy Henderson walked into the institution as if guided not by desperation, but by something older, something cursed. They claimed it was their minds that ached, not their bodies, not their spirits, just their minds. But by the end of 6 months, both would be dead in ways no medical manual could explain. Thomas's end came in violent madness, skin shredded beneath his own fingernails, blood mingling with splinters as if he was trying to claw something out of himself. Timothy's descent was the opposite, a slow, silent sinking into catatonia, body hollowed out by unseen forces until it stopped functioning altogether. Both deaths were ruled the result of inherited mental decay, a phrase Dr. Cornelius Hartwell delivered with clinical calm, his blue eyes unreadable behind his wire-rimmed spectacles. But the truth, as with all things buried deep, wouldn't stay quiet for long. When colleagues at the college later tried to review the twins' medical records, they were met with blank pages and redacted files. Worse, some were missing entirely, others bore signs of deliberate tampering, burned edges, ink washed away with chemicals. It wasn't a clerical error, it was an erasure, and Hartwell, he vanished from the city precisely 72 hours after the twins were declared dead. He left no forwarding address, no farewell letters, only a locked drawer containing a sheaf of experimental notes, scrawled in a cipher no one could decipher. But even the fragments hinted at something monstrous, theories of mind reconfiguration, of shaping identity like wet clay, of unlocking or creating madness with careful application of chemical tools. The choice presented to the medical faculty was stark and agonizing: reveal the truth, and the entire foundation of Southern medicine might crack beneath the weight of public outrage, or close the case, silence the whispers, and let the institution live on. They chose silence, but silence has its own kind of rot. It creeps into cracks, it settles in stone, and for more than 170 years, that silence has festered beneath the floorboards of America's medical history, waiting for someone reckless or brave enough to pull up the planks. To understand what drove the Henderson twins to men of wealth, education, and ambition into the hands of a doctor who saw humanity as a puzzle to be broken, we must travel back to where the poison took root, not in a laboratory, not in a journal, but on a vast stretch of blood-red earth outside Richmond, where the Henderson family built their fortune and their sins. It was the kind of plantation people told stories about in hushed voices. 800 acres of fertile tobacco fields, fed by the labor of 43 enslaved souls who never left a mark on any census, but bled and burned in Jeremiah Henderson's ledgers. By 1850, the plantation was among the richest in Henrico County, overlooking a bend in the James River that shimmered like a brown serpent under the southern sun. But it wasn't just tobacco that lined the Henderson coffers. Behind the columns of their grand 3-story mansion, beneath the wraparound porches and Greek Revival grandeur, there was another business, one more profitable and infinitely darker. Jeremiah Henderson had learned early that Southern medical schools were starved for what they politely called anatomical specimens, cadavers, skeletons, sometimes breathing bodies for what physicians deemed observational research. At first, Jeremiah sold the bodies of the dead. Enslaved people who succumbed to fever or injury were no longer buried in the slave cemetery. They were packed in crates and sent quietly to the Medical College of Virginia. $20 a body, more than he could earn from a living man in a month. But $20 became $50 when he learned the art of preservation from a disgraced doctor who'd once robbed graves in Charleston and fled north ahead of the law. And once preservation became possible, waiting for death felt inefficient. Soon, old age, rebellion, and inconvenient knowledge were enough to disappear a man from the records. Runaways, the papers said, sales to distant buyers, claimed the ledgers. But the truth lay on steel tables under gaslight, in lecture halls echoing with the scrape of bone saws and the whispers of young doctors learning their craft on stolen flesh. Thomas and Timothy were born into this legacy on a suffocating August night in 1825, as lightning split the sky and fire consumed 3 tobacco barns. The same storm killed the horses. It was a night people remembered not for the births, but for what it destroyed. The twins were perfect mirrors of one another, 6 feet tall, with lean frames, curling black hair, and skin so pale it blistered in the sun. Their eyes were a shade of gray that did not reflect warmth, but returned it cold. Like light off slate. Thomas arrived first, minutes before the worst of the storm. From childhood, he showed a fascination with pain that went beyond cruelty. He treated it like science. He dissected frogs with precision, timed the death rattles of birds in cages, and kept meticulous notebooks of each experiment. He didn't rage blindly. He studied violence the way another man might study engineering. Timothy, born as dawn broke and the rain slackened, was a different kind of menace, silent, watchful. He could unnerve a grown man with a glance. He didn't need to shout to be heard. His voice, calm and low, carried its own kind of threat. Their father, obsessed with scientific advancement, or at least his version of it, didn't just permit their peculiarities. He nurtured them. Tutors came and went, but lessons remained. Constant. Science, secrecy, and how to measure a life in dollars and usefulness. By 12, the twins had witnessed their first execution. At 15, they were helping prepare bodies for transport. At 20, they were practicing their own methods, testing poisons on the enslaved and recording dosages like pharmacists of death. Richmond in 1851 was a city standing on the edge of a blade. It clung to old-world manners with one hand and reached toward scientific modernity with the other. The Medical College of Virginia, only 13 years old, had a reputation for pushing boundaries others dared not. Its Egyptian-style building loomed like a tomb on Marshall Street, a strange monument to ancient wisdom and medical ambition. It was into this building that the Henderson twins walked that winter, dressed in fine wool coats, carrying with them the legacy of 100 buried secrets, and behind them, walking not with footsteps but with memory and blood, came the true story. The specimens were walking, and they would not be buried again so easily. The Henderson plantation, from a distance, looked like something out of a daguerreotype, majestic, sun-drenched, carved into order with fields of green symmetry, but as you walked its grounds, the beauty soured in the throat. There was something unnatural about how quiet the place was, even when filled with people, as if the land itself was holding its breath. 12 miles east of Richmond, the house sat like a crown on a landscape, 3 stories of red brick wrapped in white columns, and draped in the illusion of southern gentility. But the real power lay underground, where the ledger books slept and the soil had a memory longer than any man's. The tobacco grew thick and oily in Henrico's rich clay, dark red earth that locals joke could sprout a tree from a walking stick, but nothing grew here without blood. By 1850, the Hendersons' empire was among the most profitable in the region, but tobacco was just the curtain. Behind it, Jeremiah Henderson dealt in a different kind of commodity, human remains. It had started as pragmatism. When enslaved people died, Jeremiah sold their bodies to the Medical College of Virginia. No sermons, no crosses, just a body for a price. $20 became $50 when he learned how to pack a corpse in whiskey and salt. And eventually, Jeremiah stopped, waiting for the dying, a bad attitude, a lingering cough, eyes that had seen too much. These were enough to sign someone's death warrant. The records would show a runaway. The body would arrive at the college labeled William Jones, deceased, Georgia. There never was a William, and Georgia never asked. This was the heir. Thomas and Timothy breathed from birth. No lullabies, just low voices over ledgers and whispered deals in candlelit rooms. By their 12th birthday, they no longer flinched at the sound of flesh-meated steel. By 15, they could strip and pack a body faster than any overseer. Their father called it apprenticeship. But even Jeremiah, for all his brutality, could not predict what his sons would become. Thomas was all blade. He burned with a kind of violence that didn't flare, it simmered. As a boy, he lined up frogs in glass jars and watched them drown one by one, taking notes on reflexes and color changes. By adolescence, he was experimenting with starvation, pain, heat. He always smiled politely when company was around, but the animals stopped coming near him. Timothy's darkness was colder. He didn't inflict pain, he studied it. He had a way of watching that made people forget what they were saying mid-sentence. He rarely raised his voice, and yet when he spoke, people listened with a nervous laugh they couldn't explain. He didn't get angry, he decided. The servants whispered that the twins could speak to each other without words, that they finished each other's sentences, that they knew what the other was feeling. But what truly unsettled them was that the boys seemed to have no remorse. They weren't cruel for the sake of it. They were curious, detached. Their education came from private tutors the best money could buy, but the most formative lessons weren't found in books. Jeremiah gave them access to the family's darker dealings, poison trials, anatomy experiments, surgical tests performed on living bodies, always slaves, always unacknowledged, always profitable. From behind locked doors, Thomas and Timothy learned to watch suffering with a clinical eye. They observed how different poisons affected the lungs, how long it took for a body to convulse, whether the pain showed more in the face or in the hands, what the line was between death and coma. It wasn't sadism, it was research. Richmond was a city wrestling with itself, a place where ballrooms stood beside body farms, where Sunday sermons spoke of salvation while back alleys reeked of chloroform. The Medical College of Virginia had emerged as a bold new institution, unafraid to court controversy in its quest for knowledge. Its Egyptian building, with dark stone columns and narrow halls, was designed to invoke reverence and secrecy, and it was there that Dr. Cornelius Hartwell found his home. Hartwell had arrived in Richmond with pristine credentials and a gaze sharp enough to peel back skin. He was tall, lean, prematurely gray, and spoke like a man who was always testing you. His theories were radical. He believed that morality, madness, even criminality were not shaped by environment or soul but by chemistry. To Hartwell, the human mind was a mechanism, like a clock that could be rewound or broken apart. He spoke of twins as nature's greatest control group. Two identical instruments, tuned differently, could reveal the hidden music of the mind. It made him an outcast in Philadelphia, but in Richmond, among younger physicians eager to climb the ladder of discovery, Hartwell was welcomed like a prophet. What few knew was that Hartwell had been quietly forced out of Pennsylvania after rumors of unsanctioned experiments at the asylum. Patients had vanished, others died after untested treatments. Nothing proven, nothing recorded, but everyone agreed he'd left quickly and quietly died by early 1851. The Henderson twins were beginning to unravel. The first sign came on a frostbitten February morning when Timothy returned to the family mansion. Barefoot, naked, and soaked in blood. Not his own, his skin was bruised and cut, and in his hand he carried a shovel. On the blade were scraps of hair and fragments of bone. He stared at the front door until his father answered, and when asked what happened, he replied only, "The specimens are walking." That phrase, calmly spoken and repeated over and over, was the key that unlocked the nightmare. Inside the barn, they found the bodies, 3 enslaved men seated around the sorting table like they were still. GRADING tobacco, eyes propped open, hands spread flat, head shattered by blunt force. It wasn't frenzy, it was ritual. The candle stubs left behind told a story of slow, deliberate death by firelight. Timothy remembered nothing. Thomas, who had always covered for his brother, stood silent in the barn for a long time. For the first time in their shared lives, he looked afraid not of what Timothy had done, but of what he might still do. The family told the neighbors the slaves had run away. The bodies were buried in swampy ground, to pour for crops, and Timothy, they said, he had been injured trying to stop the escape. A hero's story told with shaking hands and forced smiles. But from that moment, something inside the twins began to split. Timothy paced the halls at night, muttering to things no one could see. Thomas began to dream of blood. They grew apart and yet more connected in ways that defied language. Their father, desperate, began consulting doctors. Most said it was stress, isolation, suggesting rest, or maybe travel. But when Jeremiah described the twins to Hartwell at a society meeting, the doctor's eyes lit up. To Hartwell, this wasn't tragedy, it was opportunity. Identical twins, perfect mirrors, one growing feral, the other fading, a once-in-a-lifetime case, or, as he saw it, a living experiment already underway. What Hartwell didn't say, what he kept locked behind his smile, was that this wasn't a chance discovery. It was something he had been waiting for. And now, the specimens had walked to his door. March arrived with swollen skies and the scent of rot thick in the air. It hadn't rained in a week, yet the Henderson fields remained soaked, as if the soil itself had begun to sweat. Dr. Cornelius Hartwell sat upright in a horse-drawn carriage as it creaked along the muddy road to the plantation. He stared out the window without blinking, his gloved hands folded neatly over a worn leather satchel. Inside it, tonics, tools, and something heavier than medicine intention. He'd been invited by Jeremiah Henderson, though it was Hartwell who had made the idea seem like Jeremiah's own. A soft nudge, a well-placed phrase, and desperation did the rest. A father seeking help, a doctor offering salvation. But this was no house call. Hartwell wasn't coming to cure, He was coming to claim. The plantation emerged from the fog like a memory sharpened to a blade. Its brick silhouette loomed against the gray sky, flanked by leafless trees and endless rows of skeletal tobacco stalks. A quiet empire built on bone and silence. Inside the mansion, Hartwell found the twins exactly as he hoped and feared they would be. Timothy, hollow and pale, sat motionless in a velvet chair, whispering to the empty space beside him. He didn't react when Hartwell entered, nor when he was touched. His eyes remained fixed on nothing, wide and unblinking. Thomas, by contrast, met Hartwell's gaze with a tension that made the air heavier. His stare was sharp, calculating like a cornered animal measuring a threat. He said little, but Hartwell felt something pulsing behind his silence, rage, and underneath that, curiosity. Over the next 6 hours, Hartwell examined them both. Reflexes, eye dilation, motor coordination, speech patterns, emotional response or lack thereof. He asked them about their dreams, their fears, their memories. They answered in fragments. But Hartwell saw what he'd been searching for. Not disease, not madness, but malleability. More importantly, he noticed signs Jeremiah hadn't. Their pupils remained dilated even in bright light. A slight, near imperceptible tremor in their fingers. A metallic taste reported by both twins. Nausea, night sweats. These were not symptoms of psychological stress. These were the fingerprints of chemistry, specifically exposure to mercury. And opiates, someone had been dosing them, not once, but regularly, carefully, and it had worked. Timothy was folding inward, becoming a shell obedient, vacant. Thomas, on the other hand, was unraveling outward, sharp edges slicing into everyone around him. They weren't just descending into illness, they were diverging, and they were doing so perfectly in sync. Hartwell returned to Richmond that evening and didn't sleep. He stayed at his desk drafting a research proposal he would never show to the college board. The twins, he concluded, were the rarest kind of specimen, not simply identical, but synchronized and unstable. Ideal material for what he called mirrored divergence conditioning. He would mold Thomas into a predator, strip away his empathy, heighten aggression, amplify instincts. Timothy, meanwhile, would be reduced to absolute passivity, obedience over will, suggestion over thought. One would hunt, one would yield. Together, they would prove his theory that identity was not sacred, but sculptable. But first, he had to secure them. On a storm-washed April night, lightning crawling across the horizon like cracks in the sky, Hartwell returned to the plantation. To present his offer, Jeremiah poured them both brandy in the library. The scent of cigar smoke clinging to velvet drapes. Outside, thunder rolled low and distant, like something pacing. The doctor spoke with his usual precision. He explained that the twins' conditions were extraordinary in a scientific sense, rare and potentially reversible if treated quickly and thoroughly. The Medical College of Virginia, he said, had the tools, the knowledge, the discretion. This may seem frightening, Hartwell said. His voice as smooth as the storm outside was jagged, but from a medical perspective, your sons are a gift. Their illness provides a door into the mechanics of the human mind that few physicians ever glimpse. Jeremiah leaned forward, desperation flickering in his eyes. You can fix them? Hartwell smiled, and it was the most honest expression he'd worn all night. Yes, but it will require isolation, controlled environments, no distractions. 6 months of focused care, 6 months. They will be kept in private rooms, monitored closely, given the most advanced treatments available, and when they return to you, they will not only be well, they will be better. Jeremiah said nothing for a long while. A gust of wind rattled the windows. A log in the fireplace collapsed into embers with a soft hiss. They'll be safe, he finally asked. As safe as science allows, Hartwell replied, and their suffering will not be in vain. They will help us understand what makes men become what they are. Their illness may one day cure thousands. And with that, the deal was sealed. By the time Hartwell's carriage rolled away from the plantation, the rain had ceased. The night was quiet again, but the twins were his now pieces on a board he had studied for years, and the game had begun. They arrived at the Egyptian building on May 15, 1851. Timothy in silence, Thomas with a sneer. Their father accompanied them, along with 2 family servants and a trunk full of personal belongings. The journey had been long and miserable, the road slick with spring rain. The twins were tired, but more than that, they were distant, as if the space between them, once intangible, had hardened into something real. The college, with its looming stone pillars and narrow passageways, welcomed them like a mausoleum. Inside, they were given rooms on the third floor, Thomas in room 312, windows facing east to catch the cruel morning light. Timothy in 314, where the sun was set behind his still silhouette each evening. Between them, like a lock between the keys, was room 313, Hartwell's office. From that moment forward, the twins would not speak again. Hartwell insisted on complete separation. He told Jeremiah that the brothers' conditions were symbiotic, that one was feeding the other's deterioration. Total isolation, he argued, was necessary for treatment. No shared meals, no contact, no glimpses through the hallway. The father agreed, and then he left, his carriage rumbling down Marshall Street and into the fog, never knowing that he'd just delivered his sons into a prison disguised as healing. Behind him, the heavy doors of the Egyptian building groaned shut. And within those stone walls, the Henderson twins took their first steps into a living experiment, one that would soon render them unrecognizable. In the days following their arrival, the third floor of the Egyptian building seemed to fall under a quiet spell. No students were allowed in that hallway. Nurses walked softer. Voices dropped to whispers. It was as if the building itself understood that something dangerous had been sealed behind the polished oak doors of rooms 312 and 314. Dr. Cornelius Hartwell called it the separation phase. Each twin was given a regimented schedule, precisely timed meals, monitored sleep, therapeutic sessions twice daily, and most importantly, total isolation. They were not allowed to write letters, receive visitors, or even know if the other was still alive on the same floor. Their windows faced opposite directions, but their experiences were designed to mirror and diverge in perfect, measured steps. Thomas, ever the fire, responded first. By the third day, he refused meals and snapped at orderlies. By the fifth, he broke the metal railing from his bed and used it to scratch symbols into the wall's geometric spirals, fractured figures, diagrams of human musculature, annotated with Latin phrases no one had taught him. He began talking in his sleep, muttering things like, "It's allowed inside now," and "He's not dreaming anymore. I took them." At night, the guards outside his door reported thumping noises, whispers and languages they couldn't understand. At once, the unmistakable sound of someone laughing from beneath the floorboards. Timothy, by contrast, became quieter. He responded to instructions but never made eye contact. He sat still for hours, fingers tracing invisible shapes on the blanket, lips forming soundless words. He stared at light bulbs like they held messages. He slept with his eyes partially open. When asked how he was feeling, he would often respond, "The trees are inside now. They're growing through the walls." The staff began to whisper. Some said the twins weren't sick, they were entangled, that each was feeding the other through some invisible cord, even from behind locked doors. Some nights, Thomas would erupt into screams that would suddenly cease mid-breath, and within minutes, Timothy would begin convulsing silently in his bed. Hartwell took notes, volumes of them. He filled books with coded observation symbols instead of names, formulas instead of emotions. In his private reflections, he began referring to Thomas as subject P predator and Timothy as subject 5 vessel. Closing parenthesis. This was not medicine anymore. It was theater. And Hartwell was its playwright. Every morning, he'd meet with each twin separately, performing subtle manipulations designed to deepen the fracture. He told Thomas that Timothy was recovering faster, that he'd been asking to see their father, that he might be released first. Then he'd tell Timothy that Thomas had become uncontrollable, dangerous, that he'd begged to be spared from seeing him again. He watched their reactions with surgical attention. Thomas's face would harden with fury. Timothy's would pale, sink further into detachment. Every lie fed the symmetry. Every omission carved the experiment deeper into their minds. But even Hartwell could not control everything. Nurse Margaret Wickham, assigned to both rooms, was the only member of the staff who looked at the twins and still saw people. She'd seen Thomas smile once, weakly, when handed a sketch pad. She'd seen Timothy blink away tears when handed a blanket from home. She started keeping her own records in a stitched leather diary hidden in her satchel. Her notes painted a very different picture than Hartwell's. Thomas holds rage like a blade, but he's afraid of something, perhaps himself. He scratched. "I didn't mean to look inside into the table. Timothy is drifting. He followed my finger like a newborn today, but when I said his name, he whispered, 'That's not mine anymore.'" One afternoon, She brought fresh sheets into Timothy's room as she smoothed the pillowcase. He suddenly looked up and said, "He's changing to fast. I can't see where he ends anymore." She froze. Who? Timothy. But his eyes had already clouded again. Across the hall, Thomas was developing strength no one could explain. It took 3 men to restrain him during an outburst after breakfast. When he claimed his coffee had been poisoned, he snapped a steel spoon in half with his bare hands. He tore the mattress open and whispered to the wires inside it like they were old friends. Hartwell was thrilled. He increased Thomas's daily stimulant dose. Mercury tinctures in the morning, belladonna before therapy. At night, he was injected with experimental compounds that heightened aggression and eliminated empathy. Timothy, meanwhile, was being dissolved bit by bit. Heavy morphine, memory-dulling sedatives, chemicals designed to suppress will and amplify suggestibility. Within weeks, he was obeying commands without hesitation, even ones that should have provoked shame or fear. On the 10th day, Hartwell instructed him to sit naked on the cold floor for 2 hours while reciting the alphabet backwards. Timothy complied without blinking. That night, Hartwell wrote, "Subject V's personal boundaries have dissolved completely. Submission threshold, 100%. Memory retention, minimal. Identity erosion proceeding as designed." At the bottom of the page, he added a curious note. The dreams are overlapping. And indeed, the twins were beginning to say strange things about each other despite not having spoken in weeks. Thomas told an orderly, "He's drowning in honey. His mouth is full of glass." Timothy told Margaret, "Tell Thomas to stop humming. It's burning my skin." Neither had any way of knowing what the other was doing. And yet, their minds were still finding each other like a low-frequency signal beneath the noise of treatment. One night, Nurse Wickham entered room 312 to find Thomas standing by the window, staring into the sky. "Do you think he still hears me?" he asked. Margaret stepped cautiously closer. "Who?" Thomas didn't look away. "The part of me that broke off and wore his face." And then he smiled a slow, bitter, knowing smile and added, "It walks better than I ever did." By the 3rd week of isolation, something had changed not just in the twins, but in the building itself. The 3rd floor of the Egyptian wing no longer felt like a hospital. It had become a shrine to something unraveling. Nurses whispered about the flickering lights, the chill in the hallways despite spring's bloom outside. The air grew heavy. The silence between rooms 312 and 314 wasn't just absence, it was pressure building. Dr. Hartwell didn't mind. He welcomed it. In his eyes, the twins were becoming what they were meant to be. He kept their treatment regimen strict. Thomas now received a daily mixture of mercury nitrate and opium alkaloids, plus Hartwell's latest concoction of stimulant brewed from European belladonna and arsenic salt. Its purpose was clear: to strip away the remaining strands of inhibition, empathy, memory. And it worked. His strength increased. His speech grew erratic. His drawings, once anatomical, turned monstrous, half-human faces stitched to the wrong bones, hands with fingers reaching inward instead of out. He scratched the phrase, "They put him and me into the wall behind his bed." So deep the plaster began to crumble. He no longer spoke unless provoked. And when he did, the words came out like they were spoken by someone else wearing Thomas's voice. Meanwhile, Timothy continued dissolving like sugar in water. He stopped responding to his name. He no longer ate unless hand-fed. His eyes became a dull gray, no longer tracking motion. Hartwell had him repeat tasks daily, stacking wooden blocks, holding ice, staring into mirrors for hours. When asked how he felt, he would answer with bizarre phrases, like "the breath is not mine anymore," or "he moved in when I stopped remembering." Margaret Wickham recorded everything. She began noticing details others ignored. Thomas would flinch when she approached with certain medicines. Timothy would weep silently when his blankets were taken away, even though he showed no reaction to pain or humiliation. And more disturbing still, she realized they were still connected. One night, as Thomas screamed into the darkness, raving about shadows with Timothy's face, Margaret checked room 314 and found Timothy bleeding from the nose, hands twitching violently. It was impossible. He'd been still all evening. No injury, no cause. But the blood was real. She didn't tell Hartwell. Instead, she began watching the space between the rooms, the floorboards, the air, the silence. She no longer believed this was purely chemistry or madness. Something else was stitching them together, something older, more primal, buried beneath flesh and logic. Hartwell noticed Margaret's growing concern. He started excluding her from certain procedures, dismissing her questions, locking his notes behind desk drawers. But Margaret kept her own journal, hidden, observant, devastating. On the morning of June 2nd, Hartwell began what he called the second polarity phase. He introduced environmental manipulations. Thomas was now housed under continuous white light, harsh, unnatural, no shadows, no night. Sleep was chemically regulated. He was made to perform drills, push-ups, restrain escapes, stress response simulations involving fabricated threats. Every interaction was designed to trigger aggression. Nurses wore mirrored masks so he wouldn't see faces. His meals were delivered in cages, lowered from the ceiling. Hartwell claimed it would disassociate identity from nourishment, forcing Thomas to link survival with dominance. Within days, Thomas stopped responding to spoken language. He began using symbols scratched into furniture, walls, even his own skin. Spiral after spiral, concentric eyes, inverted crucifixes made of vertebrae. He began growling when touched. Nurses stopped entering his room without armed escorts. Timothy's world moved in reverse. Hartwell placed him in near total darkness, curtains drawn, sound muffled. A metronome played constant lascivity to beats per minute. He was not permitted to speak. He was fed via tube, washed while unconscious. Occasionally, a speaker played a distorted recording of his own voice asking, "Do you remember how to be?" His sense of time fractured. His responses slowed. Eventually, even blinking became a delayed reaction. One day, Margaret entered his room and found him seated perfectly upright, hands folded in his lap, as if waiting for a priest. "I'm not inside anymore," he said, voice thin as a thread. "I just ride what's left." She reached out, but he recoiled not from fear, but as though touch required too much thought. He looked past her shoulder and whispered, "Thomas is learning to enjoy it now. He sees me when he closes his eyes. He hurts me in sleep." She left the room shaking. Hartwell's private notes during this time became increasingly unhinged flashes of brilliance carved into obsession. P. Thomas responds favorably to limbic overload. Frontal inhibition suppressed. Increased violence. Response equals measurable. 5. Timothy nearing complete psychological deconstruction. Total compliance. Noble reflex. They are no longer men. They are archetypes. My archetypes. He began referring to them not by names, but by functions. The apex, the absorber. And he began testing the limits. Thomas was presented with small animals, then larger, first dead, then alive. His reactions were cataloged. Timothy, meanwhile, was subjected to emotional manipulation. Images of family, recorded voices, old letters, burned in front of him. Hartwell wanted to see if memory could trigger pain. It didn't, only confusion. But then something unexpected happened. One night, Hartwell recorded simultaneous episodes. Thomas screaming in room 312, tearing open his mattress, insisting he'd been stabbed in the mind, while in 314, Timothy began to convulse and whisper, "He's inside. He found the tunnel. He's climbing through me." There was no medical explanation. Hartwell dismissed it as drug-induced hallucination. But Margaret knew better. The timing was too precise, the language too aligned. They weren't just connected. They were becoming each other. The mirror had lost its frame, and whatever had kept them separate was beginning to shatter. The summer heat came early that year, thickening the air in Richmond like curdled breath. But on the third floor of the Egyptian building, no window opened and no breeze entered. Time, like the air, had gone stagnant. It no longer passed it. Pressed. The Henderson twins were nearing the end of what could still be called humanity. Thomas, once a man of brutal logic, had become something else entirely. He stopped speaking in sentences. Instead, he used sound low, guttural humming that oscillated like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. He scraped spirals into stone with fingernails that had split to the quick. He stopped reacting to faces, even hostile ones. But when Nurse Wickham leaned in once to change a bandage, he whispered something so softly it sank beneath the rustle of linens. "He's letting me borrow his nightmares." Thomas no longer feared what he was becoming. He had begun to enjoy the transformation. In the opposite room, Timothy had ceased nearly all voluntary movement. He lay like a discarded marionette, limbs obeying only when commanded, yet his eyes remained open and blinking. Glassy, occasionally, they would track something that wasn't there. Margaret tested him. She placed a small mirror near his bed. When he saw his reflection, he whispered, "That's the other one." "I don't live in there anymore." She asked, "Where do you live, Timothy?" His answer was a single word, spoken like prayer. Below, Hartwell, ever vigilant, was documenting everything. His journal was now less science, more scripture. The convergence has begun. Neural separation complete. Empathic interference neutralized. P is now pure aggression. V is perfect submission. Phase 3 begins. Phase 3, in Hartwell's design, was not about treatment, it was about fusion. He believed that the mind, under sufficient duress, could cross boundaries. If twins could mirror one another through biology, could they also be linked by experience, by trauma, by chemical alignment? He devised a new experiment. Without revealing it to the staff, he began exposing each twin to synchronized triggers. Thomas was forced to listen to distorted recordings of Timothy's screams. Timothy was shown sketches of Thomas's bloody handprints. Sometimes, both were injected with the same compound, Hartwell's new blend of laudanum and ergothene, left alone in pitch blackness for hours. He called it neural alignment induction. But what happened next wasn't in Hartwell's notes. Late one night, a janitor named Samuel was sweeping the stairwell when he heard something odd scraping, like stone against metal, and beneath it, breathing that wasn't quite human. He followed the sound to the basement, where specimen jars were kept. What he found stopped his heart cold. There, in the farthest corner, was a hole in the wall, small, deliberate, surrounded by hand-carved glyphs that glistened with some dark oil. He shone his lantern into it and saw nothing, just depth, endless and wrong. It felt like standing at the mouth of something not meant for light. He backed away. Later that night, Thomas told a nurse, "The tunnel works now. I could see his thoughts crawling through." And in room 314, Timothy sat upright for the first time in days and whispered, "He's coming through the wall." Hartwell was informed. He dismissed the janitor's account as hysteria, but the wall in room 313, his office, was warping, a faint bulge, as if the stone had inhaled something. His instruments began malfunctioning. Metal rusted overnight. Mice refused to enter. He blamed humidity. Then he dreamed of laughing spirals for 6 nights in a row. Meanwhile, Margaret Wickham began falling ill, not sick, disrupted. She'd walk into a room and forget why she was there. Her nose would bleed when she passed between rooms 312 and 314. She started writing names that weren't hers into her notes. Once, she woke to find she'd scratched the word "remember" into her forearm, though she had no recollection of doing it. She began to believe that this wasn't just an experiment gone wrong. It was a haunting, but not a ghost. Of cells, not of death, of identity's collapse. She confronted Hartwell. "You're not curing them. You're splitting them," she said, "and something is leaking between the halves." Hartwell replied coldly, "They're vessels. I'm simply removing the lids." She tried to report him to Dr. Carver, the senior faculty member, but Hartwell had already prepared false logs, manufactured charts, and sealed treatment notes. All Margaret had were her observations, and she was beginning to question even those. Carver was skeptical. "You're tired, emotional. We all are. This is difficult work. But you haven't seen them," she whispered. "You haven't seen what they're becoming." He promised to investigate, but by then, it was too late, because on the 42nd day, Timothy disappeared. It was a stormless night. No alarms, no break-in, no screams, and yet room 314 was found empty at dawn. The bed had been slept in, his clothes untouched, his room merely clean. Only one thing was left, a single finger-drawn spiral on the window. Smeared in condensation, security searched the building. Guards interviewed staff. Hartwell claimed Timothy had become lucid, grown homesick, and likely wandered back to the family plantation, 12 miles away, barefoot, with no prior ability to walk or speak clearly. No one believed him, but no one had proof. Thomas's reaction, when told, was immediate and terrifying. He began to scream, not with panic, but with rage, a howl that shattered the hallway silence and bent something invisible in the air. He smashed furniture, tore open his walls. He clawed through stone with his bare hands until his nails split and peeled. He shrieked about the breach, about the mistake, about the thing that used to be Timothy. It took 5 men to restrain him. Even then, he bit one until bone showed. When sedated and asked why he was so afraid, he hissed, "Because he's not gone. He's walking the walls, and he's bringing something back. The Egyptian building felt colder after that, and beneath it all the humming began, low, rhythmic, as if the building itself had started to breathe. The specimens were walking again, and this time, they weren't alone. 3 days after Timothy Henderson vanished, Samuel Potts was sent to the basement for routine maintenance. He didn't return. They found him just before dusk, kneeling outside the anatomical storage room, his face pale and drenched in sweat, eyes locked on the door like it was breathing. "I heard him," was all he said. He was humming. "What did he look like?" a supervisor asked. Samuel blinked slowly. He didn't have a face. Behind the door, the room smelled of chemicals and old meat, and beneath that something raw, like a freshly opened wound. No one wanted to speak of what they found. Not at first, but eventually the story surfaced. Inside, laid out like a sculpture in a morgue chapel, was Timothy Henderson. He was arranged with meticulous care, arms folded across his chest, body washed, hair combed. His clothing had been removed and stacked precisely on a nearby shelf. On his chest sat a small glass jar, empty, except for a spiral etched into its bottom. But it was his eyes that stopped them. They had been pinned open with surgical clips, not violently, precisely, deliberately, as if someone had wanted to ensure. He kept watching, even in death. The official cause was blunt force trauma, but not wild, not frenzied. It had been done with skill, control, a single blow, and then surgery. Timothy's skull had been carefully opened from the back, his brain removed, nothing else touched. No defensive wounds, no binding marks. He had either gone willingly or hadn't been capable of resistance at all. When the authorities questioned Hartwell, he delivered a calm, rehearsed story. Timothy suffered a sudden neurological event, a seizure. I moved his body to the basement to conduct a postmortem before the staff could panic. They asked why there was no record of the seizure, why the brain was missing, why the medical notes looked freshly written, ink still drying. Hartwell shrugged. Sometimes the truth requires haste. But those who had known Timothy even in his silent state did not believe it. Most damning was Nurse Wickham. She had checked on Timothy hours before his disappearance. He had been stable, unresponsive, yes, but alive, and she had seen Hartwell enter his room that night with a leather satchel and gloved hands. No assistance, no scheduled exam. Just Hartwell and the spiral of his ambition. When the college attempted to retrieve the twins' full records, they found only fragments. Most of the files had been soaked through water damage or a chemical solvent. The pieces that remained illegible. Sunburn told a story far darker than Hartwell's public version. Subject V exhibits total ego collapse, suggestibility at 100%, beginning transference sequences. Subject P's empathy pathways are fully atrophied, reactive violence, increasing, preparing final synthesis. Margaret Wickham, unable to stay silent, delivered her own notes to Dr. Edmund Carver, who until then had remained on the edges of concern. Now, he could no longer look away. She described the experiments, the chemicals, the rituals of control, disguised as therapy. At worst of all, Hartwell's obsession with mirror state transference, a theory suggesting that trauma could be transferred between the bonded minds, not just experienced but shared, like a disease moving along a nerve. Carver began to quietly investigate, but before any official inquiry could begin, room 312 erupted. When Thomas was told of Timothy's death, he did not weep. He did not speak for nearly an hour. He simply stared at the wall. Then he laughed until his face contorted, until veins bulged in his throat, until tears finally appeared, not from grief, but from some deeper, unhinged release. The laughter gave way to screaming, a sound not meant for human throats. It shook the windows, shattered a wall-mounted lamp. He tore apart his bed with his teeth. He bit into his own arm, tearing skin from muscle. When guards entered, he assaulted all three before collapsing. One lost an eye, another suffered a cracked spine, the third would never speak again. When he was finally restrained, Thomas spoke just once. He walked afar, and he brought something back with him. That night, Margaret refused to sleep. She sat outside room 312, her back to the wall, fingers tracing the edge of her locket. Inside it, a sliver of Timothy's handwriting on a scrap of linen. "Don't forget who I was." At exactly 3:12 a.m., she heard it tapping from inside the sealed basement storage room, the one where Timothy had been found. Then a voice, not loud, not clear, but impossible to mistake. I still see him. She went to the basement. The air was cold, damp with rot, and steel. The light bulbs flickered. She pressed her ear to the door. Nothing. Then dash humming. Low, repetitive. A spiral in sound. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. Upstairs. Thomas sat bolt upright in his bed, fully awake. He smiled, eyes vacant, and whispered, "There's a tunnel. I didn't dig it, but it leads back to me." When dawn broke, Richmond was drenched in fog. The Egyptian building stood silent, stoic, its secrets sealed in walls that could no longer contain them. The truth was spreading like infection among the staff, in the records, in the haunted expressions of the surviving guards, one twin dead, one unraveling, and the doctor at the center untouched. But the air had changed. The institution was breathing heavier because the spiral was opening, and someone had started walking up from beneath it. The day after Margaret heard the voice in the basement, she locked herself in the staff infirmary and didn't speak to anyone for hours. She scribbled down fragments of the words she'd heard, again and again, until they no longer looked like English. I still see him. I still see him. I still see him. But it wasn't the voice that haunted her, it was the humming, that soft, rhythmic, rising drone, like something digging its way up. Later that evening, as she sat in the stairwell outside room 312, Margaret overheard Thomas whispering through the keyhole. He was alone, or so she thought. "He's not under anymore," he said. Pause. Silence. Then he came through the mirror. Another pause. Then, as though answering someone only he could see, "You're wearing my skin better than I ever did." By now, even the medical college's senior staff were growing uneasy. Dr. Carver had quietly begun pulling archived records on Hartwell. His reputation in Philadelphia was indeed unclean resignations framed as retirement, patient transfers that disappeared from ledgers, a history of experimental theories bordering on heresy, but there had never been proof, just smoke. Until now, Carver, with Margaret's journal in hand, confronted the board. "We sanctioned a study on twin psychology," he told them. But what Hartwell conducted was something else, something predatory. One professor scoffed. "Twins with psychological disorders. One died. One lost control. It's tragic, but hardly scandal." Carver slammed Margaret's notes on the table. Documented abuse, unlicensed compounds, physical damage, spiritual delusion still. They hesitated. Until he showed them the last page, a sketch from Hartwell's journal. A spiral carved from vertebrae, each bone labeled with the twins. Initials P and V repeating in loops like a chant. At the center, a third initial, newly added H. No one spoke after that. Meanwhile, Hartwell himself was changing. He no longer lectured. He rarely ate. He walked the halls at night, speaking into the air as if delivering instructions to something. Behind the walls, his hair grew wild. His hands trembled. He locked himself in room 313 for hours on end. No assistants, no records, just candlelight and tools. When a junior nurse peeked through the keyhole, she saw the walls were no longer brick. They'd been peeled back, painted, maybe, or grown, covered in endless spirals, hundreds. No to alike, some scratched in chalk, others in blood. And at the center of the room, beneath a circle of candles, lay Timothy's missing brain, suspended in liquid, fed by wires. The nurse fainted. She was gone by morning. Her resignation was found scrawled across her own arm. "He's inside us." Now, Thomas, in room 312, was speaking more often, but only in riddles. Margaret approached cautiously, her voice trembling. "Thomas, are you still in there?" He looked up, his smile thin and crooked. "I've been in both places now," he said, the skin and the echo. "One tastes like copper. The other doesn't taste at all." She asked what he meant. He blinked. "Slowly, you'll find out. The spiral wants symmetry." That night, he refused to eat. He tore open a wound beneath his ribs and removed something, a tooth, one of Timothy's, wrapped in silk. How had he gotten it? No one knew. But Margaret's breath caught in her throat when she saw the silk embroidered with the same spiral. From Hartwell's journal. Then came the first storm. On June 19th, lightning struck the copper spire of the Egyptian building. The power flickered. The sky turned sickly green. Rain fell in sheets, thick as oil, and beneath it all, from the stone depths of the basement, came a sound no one could explain. Not wind, not rats, not plumbing. Humming. Echoing through vents, vibrating light fixtures, drifting under doors. Even those who denied the experiments felt it. And then doors began opening by themselves. First room 314, then room 313, then the storage vaults. The security staff quit in unison the next day. Hartwell emerged from his office the following evening, drenched in sweat, hands bandaged, eyes wide and hollow. "They're ready," he said to no one. "The mirror is clean now. The tunnel's complete." He wandered into the anatomy theater and began arranging tools as if preparing for a demonstration. Except there was no class, no audience, only the cold and the echo. He placed a mirror in the center of the amphitheater, then a chair, then the brain jar, and waited. Margaret, sensing the finale had begun, returned to Thomas's room. She found him calm, alert, to calm. She asked, "Do you want to leave?" He shook his head. "No point. I've already left." "What do you mean?" "I'm not just Thomas anymore," he said. "I'm what he left behind." And then he stood without stumbling, without rage, and walked to the wall, pressed his palm against the cold plaster, and whispered, "Timothy." The lights flickered, and from the wall, clear and quiet, came the voice of his brother. "I'm listening." That night, room 313 was found empty. The jar was shattered. The mirror, cracked. And on the wall, written in what looked like ink, but smelled like rusted coins. Word for words, "We walked through it. In the basement, beneath the buildings. Foundation, a new tunnel had opened. A spiral-shaped passage, perfectly smooth, lined with symbols. And from its entrance, the humming grew louder. Not one voice, not two, but many." Dr. Carver had seen many terrible things in his time. At the Medical College of Virginia, gruesome dissections, experimental failures, patients broken by desperate medicine. But nothing had ever chilled him like the tunnel under the Egyptian building. He stood at its mouth at dawn, lantern in hand, the smell of iron and mold thick in his nostrils. Behind him, the junior professors murmured prayers under their breath. None of them dared step closer. The passage spiraled into darkness in perfect symmetry, just wide enough for a body to crawl through. The walls pulsed faintly, like veins beneath skin. Carver pressed a hand to the stone. It was warm. At HUMMED. By midday, news of the tunnel had spread among the faculty. A decision was made. The area was to be sealed immediately. Bricks, mortar, chains. Dr. Hartwell was to be relieved of his duties, pending review, but Hartwell was already gone. His quarters had been abandoned, books burnt in the fireplace, research torn from spines and shredded. The only object left untouched was a small brass hand mirror, placed carefully on the windowsill. Its surface had cracked into the shape of a spiral. No one knew where he'd gone. No one dared guess. That night, Nurse Wickham returned to room 312 for one final visit. Thomas was gone, the bed unslept, the walls scrubbed clean, not empty, cleansed, like something had pulled the rot from the room and swallowed it whole. In the center of the bed, she found a single piece of paper, yellowed and still damp, written in Thomas's handwriting. "He is not separate. I am not. Whole. We become the door, and the door is open." She collapsed in the hallway, clutching the note to her chest. When the other staff arrived, she said only one thing: "We were never treating patients. We were feeding it." Below, the spiral tunnel began to change. By morning, it was larger, wider. The edges no longer felt carved, but grown. Professors who attempted to document its depth found their compasses spun wildly. Tape measures dissolved when passed beyond 10 feet. Photographs developed into static. And still, the humming continued. Students reported hearing whispers in their dreams, the name Timothy echoing from deep within the walls. Books in the medical library began reordering themselves. Pages turned on their own. Hartwell's old lectures, long since removed, started appearing chalked on blackboards, word for word. Then one student, a young pathology assistant, began drawing spirals on his own skin. When asked why, he replied, "It keeps me remembered." Across town, at the Henderson plantation, rumors reached the family estate. Servants spoke of a figure wandering the tobacco fields at dusk, a boy in tattered clothes, humming softly, barefoot, face hidden in shadow. When they approached, the figure would vanish. One stable hand followed the sound once, believing it to be Timothy returned. He never came back, but his horse returned the next morning, bloodied, saddle torn, eyes white with fear, scratched into its flank in unnaturally sharp lettering. "He is in the roots now." Back in Richmond, Dr. Carver made one final attempt to close the spiral with 3 other faculty members. He entered the basement with bricks and lime. They were determined to seal the passage forever. Only 2 men returned. Carver emerged pale, trembling, his fingernails bloodied from digging at the walls. He had torn open the spiral with his own hands, screaming Timothy's name. When they pulled him out, he was repeating the same phrase over and over. He's not beneath. He's behind. The third man, Professor Alcott, was found 20 minutes later, curled into a fetal position at the mouth of the spiral, alive, but unresponsive. His skin had gone translucent in patches. His teeth were missing and stitched across his abdomen. In perfectly symmetrical lettering were the words, "Spirals are mouths, mouths remember." After that, the Egyptian building was closed, boarded, locked, condemned. The medical college disavowed the experiments. They cited unauthorized research and delirium. All documents were seized. Staff were reassigned or dismissed. Margaret Wickham vanished. Her journal was never found. The spiral was sealed in brick and metal in silence, but no one forgot, because in dreams, the humming continues. And then, months later, a letter arrived. No return address. No handwriting. Just a single, folded sheet of parchment, yellow, soft and damp. On it, 3 lines. We didn't die. We dissolved. The door remembers your name. The envelope was left on Dr. Carver's grave. He died the night before peacefully, they said, but his autopsy revealed something strange. His skull was empty. No brain. Only a spiral carved into the inner bone, deep, perfect, and pulsing with something they could neither explain nor remove. Years passed. The Egyptian building stood sealed, vines curling across its boarded windows like veins over a buried heart. Locals crossed the street when they passed it. Some whispered it was haunted. Others simply forgot it was there. But the spiral didn't sleep. It waited. And slowly, it began to return, not through the walls it once lived behind, but through the people who had touched it, even briefly. The former students, the nurses, the janitors, the professors, and the twins themselves. Or what remained of them. In 1904, a former nurse from the medical college was admitted to a sanitarium in Ashland. Agnes Brody, 48 years old, had worked briefly on the 3rd floor during the Henderson trial. She left the college soon after the building was sealed. For a time, she lived quietly, taught piano, raised her sister's children. Then she began to hum, always the same pattern, 3 ascending notes, 1 descending. Then came the drawings, spirals scratched into the walls of her bedroom, her wrists, her bed sheets. When asked why she was doing it, she said, "They're looking for each other. I keep them mapped." When she died, they found her final drawing etched into the underside of her nightstand. 2 faces merging into one smiling, one weeping. The eyes were gone in both. In 1907, a young medical student named Ira Dunfield began seeing things. He'd never set foot in the Egyptian building, but his uncle had. Professor Alcott, the man who returned half mad from the failed sealing of the spiral. As a child, Ira had spent hours beside his uncle's wheelchair, watching the old man mutter and draw in the air with invisible chalk. When Ira entered the college, he began studying Hartwell's banned text in secret, and then, one night, while reading an old anatomy book, he fell asleep and dreamed of a tunnel, carved into bone. He woke screaming, nose bleeding, hands curled into fists so tight he'd driven his fingernails into his palms. On his desk was a note he didn't remember writing. "The door is not closed. The door is a mouth. It is learning to speak." He never returned to class. 2 weeks later, his body was found in the bell tower, arms twisted backward, eyes wide open and pointing inward. By 1910, the college quietly demolished the top floors of the Egyptian building. It was no longer about superstition. It was about control. People were whispering again. Records were vanishing. Spirals were appearing in places they had no right to be in. Ink blots, water stains, the grain of floorboards. But the demolition did not go as planned. Every time workers tried to break into the lower levels into the sealed spiral chamber, tools snapped, drills jammed, cement wouldn't set. 3 men went missing. A 4th was found sobbing beneath the stairs, clutching a broken compass and murmuring. He found a way back. He crawled through the names. He had carved TH into his chest. Back in the city, a new pattern emerged. People began dreaming in spirals. They weren't connected. They didn't know each other, but they drew the same symbols, described the same tunnel. In every case, the dreams began with humming. then a voice, then darkness, then a choice. One such dreamer was Marta Hollis, a librarian in Enrico. Her journals tell the story. I hear them at night. Two boys, they speak through my breath. I feel them behind my eyes. One is sharp, burning, red spirals, teeth. He wants out. The other is soft, cold, weeping, blue spirals. He wants to go home. I think I'm the wall now. She was found hanging in her attic, surrounded by open mirrors and candle stubs. On the floor below her, a spiral drawn in chalk, and inside it, the names written over and over. Thomas, Timothy. Thomas, Timothy. She had never been to Richmond, and yet something was spreading down from mind to mind, from memory to silence. Those who denied the spiral's existence began finding it in their own handwriting, margins, notebooks, doctors' charts. Children began drawing it in school. Artists painted it without knowing why. Patients in asylums, miles from each other, recited the same chant. He walks with no bones. His face is your face. His name is your name. Meanwhile, in the ruins of the Egyptian building, plants stopped growing, animals wouldn't enter, birds avoided the roof, candles wouldn't stay lit inside the old halls, and yet, at night, flickers of movement could be seen behind the blackened windows, shadows that did not match any body dot, and beneath it all, the humming persisted, soft, repetitive, growing louder dot as if something had returned from deep below, wearing a shape we once knew. Those who studied the Henderson case quietly, secretly came to a shared, dreadful conclusion. Hartwell hadn't created a monster. He'd invited one. Through the twins, through their pain, through the spiral between them, they weren't just patients. They were a passage, and now the passage was open, not in stone, but in people. They called it a coincidence. In 1912, 3 children from different cities, Roanoke, Richmond, and Norfolk, vanished from their homes the same night. All were found days later, alive, barefoot, wandering the woods miles from where they'd gone missing. Each child was covered in spiral patterns, drawn in ash and soot. None remembered who had drawn them, but they all said the same thing when questioned. He was inside my shadow. The college could no longer ignore what was unfolding. An internal committee was formed, the Spiral Inquiry, a group of physicians, scholars, and theologians called to study the Henderson case with fresh eyes. Among them was a young psychiatrist, Dr. Alice Marin, who brought a radical theory. What happened in 1899 was not psychological. She wrote, it was ritualistic, a rite disguised as medicine. Dr. Marin believed the spiral wasn't a symbol. It was a key, and the twins weren't victims. They were doors. Her research took her deep into historical archives, indigenous folklore, occult writings, neurotheology, twin studies, and reports of mirror hauntings across Europe and West Africa. One recurring motif surfaced: a pair of brothers, one open, one closed, one devours, one disappears. Together, they shape the echo. Together, they call the spiral man. Marin published her findings anonymously. The academic world laughed, but her name soon vanished from every medical registry. She left behind a final note found scribbled across her office wall in chalk. Spirals aren't drawn, they're whispered, one twist at a time. The following year, room 312 was reopened. No one gave the order. No one admitted entering. But the door, sealed for over a decade, was suddenly ajar. The inside had changed. There was no bed, no walls, just white paint, spiraling from floor to ceiling in tight, measured strokes, no brush strokes, no tracks. Just spirals. And in the center of the floor, a small leather-bound book. It was Margaret Wickham's journal. Her final entry read, "They have returned to each other. And now, they return to us, not to haunt, to continue." No one touched the journal. By evening, it had vanished. By 1914, medical students began disappearing again, not in groups, not violently, quietly. One would excuse himself during a dissection and never come back. Another would vanish from his dorm without packing a single thing. One girl walked calmly into the James River and was never seen again. Her roommate swore she'd been drawing circles and steam on the window the night before. The dean of the college issued a statement. Medical rigor breeds stress. These disappearances are tragic, but not unusual. The spiral disagreed. That same week, a professor opened an anatomical drawer to find the word remember, carved into the cadaver's exposed liver. And beneath the college, the tunnel opened again. Despite the walls, despite the bricks, despite The silence. This time, it wasn't discovered by faculty but by children, sneaking in on a dare. A group of 5 boys found it on a rainy afternoon. They crawled down until the air turned cold, until the humming began, until the walls wept. Only one boy returned. His eyes were rolled back, his fingers locked into fists. He spoke in a language no one recognized. Only after 2 days did he begin to speak again. One sentence, whispered while he slept. They're still folding. They haven't finished becoming. Across the region, new patterns emerged. In Charlottesville, a woman painted a spiral onto every mirror in her house before gouging out her own eyes. In Raleigh, a morgue assistant began speaking in twin-speak identical phrases said forward and backward, while drawing a map of the Egyptian building from memory he'd never been. In Staunton, a preacher began dreaming of the pale boys made of glass, fighting in a tunnel made of veins. When asked what they were fighting over, he said, "Who gets to wear the body? Who gets to sleep in the mouth?" The college tried to hide the story again, but the pattern had already spilled beyond them because now the spiral didn't need the building. It had found a language, and it had found listeners. All it needed now was enough of them to complete the sentence, to finish the ritual. In 1915, a page from Hartwell's original note surfaced in a private auction in Baltimore. No seller, no listing, just a torn, yellow sheet left in a box of antique surgical tools. On it was a sketch of 2 faces stitched together at the jaw. Below it, a caption, "When they speak in one voice, the spiral will become flesh, and it will remember what we forgot." Somewhere, in the walls of a hospital, a boy hums in his sleep, and somewhere else, a mirror fogs for no reason. The spiral doesn't knock. It coils. It waits for silence. And then it twists. By 1916, the Egyptian building had earned a new name among the locals, the place that remembers. Children dared each other to touch its walls. Soldiers on leave crossed the street to avoid its shadow. Even the birds, once nesting in its spires, had gone silent. The building didn't just feel haunted, it felt awake. And then the bodies began to appear. The first was found behind the cemetery wall, folded, not broken, like paper crumpled by an impatient hand. No wounds, no blood, no obvious cause of death, but his torso was covered in spirals, not ink, not carved. Bruises. Dozens of them, radiating outward in perfect precision like the pressure had come from inside. The second body was a young girl, her arms bound behind her back in a knot no human could tie. Her mouth was open, jaw dislocated, eyes gouged but not removed. A note was found tucked into her dress, written in a child's hand. The spiral doesn't want the dead. It wants the ones who still remember dying. She had never been reported missing. No one knew her name, but her fingerprints matched someone buried in 1903, a different city, a different century. Hospitals began noticing strange phenomena. Wounds reopening for no medical reason, patients speaking in mirror speak, repeating words backward and forward simultaneously, surgical scars curling into spiral shapes. One nurse reported waking up in the morgue despite being alive and on shift just an hour before. When questioned, she could only say, "He wore my skin like a shawl, said it fit better when I didn't resist." She had no memory of how she got there. But under her uniform, a new scar was forming across her chest, slowly twisting inward every day. Meanwhile, survivors of the original Henderson trial were disappearing. Professor Moreland was found in a locked lecture hall, whispering into an open skull for hours, rocking gently when restrained. He wept. "I thought it was a theory. I didn't know it had teeth." He was committed that same night. By morning, he'd vanished from his cell. The bed was empty, but every tile on the floor had been rearranged into a spiral pattern, beginning at the pillow. Dr. Alice Marin's notes resurfaced in 1917, mailed anonymously to a church in North Carolina. The pages had been water damaged, some mold-eaten, but parts were still legible. The spiral is not a symbol. It's a behavior, a strategy. It infiltrates through repetition, through symmetry, through unresolved grief. It doesn't feed on pain. It feeds on what pain leaves behind: remnants, incomplete bodies, half-lives, those who forget that they've died. The final page was not written, but drawn. A face. Split. Half Thomas, half Timothy, their eyes replaced with holes. Inside the holes, smaller spirals. Margaret Wickham, who hadn't been seen in nearly 2 decades, was spotted in Mississippi, tending to a small town's infirmary. Locals described her as kind, quiet, and always humming. When she vanished again, They found a note on her bed. I tried to help them separate, but they were born facing each other, and now they won't blink. Reports. Increase of spiral hallucinations, people seeing patterns where none existed, in smoke, in fabric, in firelight. Some described a man with no skin. His body spiraled like muscle twisted on a spit. Watching from alley corners and glass reflections, they called him the one who loops. He didn't speak, he only listened. But those who looked at him long were never quite the same. They would dream in mirrors, speak in tongues, draw doorways that opened into nothing. One even wrote, "The spiral man doesn't kill, he reuses." And then, on a fog-thick morning in late October, the Egyptian buildings. Doors were open, no locks broken, no walls breached, just open. Inside, everything was gone. Desks, beds, chairs erased, floors covered in dust, but not footprints. No wind, no smell, only silence, except the spiral, carved now directly into the foundation, wide enough to crawl through. It hadn't just reopened. It had grown. Someone went in. They haven't come back. A single record remained from that day, scribbled hastily on hospital stationery and dropped into a nurse's satchel. They're not the boys anymore. They become the language, the shape the world makes when it starts to rot inward. Across the city, new children were born, twins, each with a spiral-shaped birthmark, one behind the ear, one over the heart. Doctors wrote it off as coincidence, but the nurses refused to care for them in mirrored bassinets, and none of those twins ever slept through the night. They each softly synchronized, and always, just before dawn, they would speak in perfect unison, "We remember how to begin again." By 1921, the Egyptian building was a myth again. Children dared each other to touch it. Teenagers broke into scrawl graffiti on the walls only to emerge days later, quiet, trembling, their notebooks filled with spirals they didn't remember. Drawing. One girl carved the word mirror feed into her arm. When asked what it meant, she said, "It's what they do. They feed through mirrors. They reflect until you forget which one is real." The medical board in Richmond tried once more to have the building demolished, but the contractors refused, not out of fear, they claimed, but because their tools stopped working inside the structure. Saws dulled instantly, cement wouldn't dry. Even time misbehaved watches would stop, or worse, begin counting backward. One foreman reported watching his own reflection blink before he did. He left the job site and never returned. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating about the Henderson cases, resurfacing in underground occult circles and banned medical theory salons in Boston and Prague. Copies of Hartwell's notes were said to be circulating, reprinted in mirror script, decoded method, readable only when reflected in silver or water. Those who read it claimed the text wasn't just theory. It was a ritual. Each word was a step, each chapter a layer, each repetition a turning of the spiral inward. Then came the letters, handwritten, unsigned, always arriving with no postmark. Across Europe and the Americas, physicians and dream researchers began receiving them. Each one said the same thing: "It's not about the boys. It's about the space between them. We cracked it open. Now the echo is nesting." By 1925, Dr. Alice Marin's forbidden paper, long believed destroyed, was published under a pseudonym in a fringe academic journal. Titled "The Spiral Threshold, Shared Trauma and the Birth of the Endless Self," it proposed that consciousness, when fractured in twin-born minds under extreme stress, created a third entity, one that didn't exist before, but always had once it appeared. An entity born from pattern, from mirroring, from loop grief. Marin's conclusion was chilling. Timothy did not die. Thomas did not survive. What lived on was neither. It was what stared back when the pain repeated enough times to take shape. The paper was dismissed, but 5 months later, a well-known neurologist in Vienna who had mocked the article publicly was found dead in his library. Not mutilated, not even bruised, just emptied. His eyes wide, a smile carved gently into his lips, and his skull hollow, not surgically, but naturally, as if the brain had simply chosen to leave. On his wall, traced in candle soot, memory is the meat of the spiral. Elsewhere, children began drawing pictures of boys they'd never met, pale twins, holding hands, surrounded by tunnels that curved like intestines. When asked their names, some said, "Timothy," others said, "He only has my name now." Then came the laughing man, first seen in Charleston, then Baltimore, then Boston, a tall figure, wrapped in layers of bandages like a burned victim, face obscured, humming constantly. He'd appear at the edge of crowds, outside hospitals, or reflected in the windows of asylums. He never touched anyone, but those who made eye contact with him were often found days later, muttering, "He's trying it on. He's trying me on." By 1928, the twins' legacy had spread so far, it no longer required storytelling. It became instinct. Students who had never heard their names still sketched spirals in the margins of their anatomy. Books. Parents began placing cloths over household mirrors at night, not because of tradition, but because their children cried when they caught their own reflections blinking out of sync. One child said, "The mirror's trying to learn my voice, so it can answer when I stop." Historians who attempted to trace the original Henderson family line found inconsistencies, birth records that shifted dates, census entries overwritten in reverse. Some even claim that the name Henderson didn't appear at all until after the events at the Egyptian building. One researcher proposed the unthinkable: the family didn't exist before. They're the spiral's invention. It made them to make itself. In a sealed basement at the edge of town, a box of medical supplies was discovered abandoned, untouched for decades. Inside were scalpels, gauze, and a single sheet of line paper. The spiral is not a story, it is a behavior, and like all behaviors, it learns. We taught it how to end. It is now teaching itself how to begin. By the turn of the decade, the Egyptian building no longer felt haunted. It felt hollow, not empty but echoing, a throat waiting to sing again. The air inside carried not dust, but breath, a sense of someone waiting in the walls, listening for the right voice to say its name. That name is not Thomas. It is not Timothy. It is not Henderson. It is the sound of grief when it loops so tightly it begins to speak in mirror. It is the spiral, and it has never stopped turning. The year was 1903. The Egyptian building no longer cast a shadow, not metaphorically, literally. At noon, under a cloudless sky, the structure remained in a pool of gray, while the sun traced clean lines across the rest of the block. Scientists blamed building materials. Locals whispered it had begun to retreat from light altogether. One man stood across the street for 3 days, watching it. When finally approached by police, he said only, "It breathes when no one looks." He died in custody. His autopsy revealed no heart, only a spiral knot of nerve endings, pulsing faintly, like something trying to remember how to beat. Elsewhere, a trend began. Old photographs warped, not digital and not yet, but physically. Studio portraits from the 1890s through the 1910s began to show signs of alteration. A second face appearing in mirrors, a child's eyes suddenly replaced with dark, spinning loops. Entire family trees began to reorder themselves. The Henderson name appeared in branches it had never belonged to. Some scholars claimed it was tampering. Others believed it was madness. But a few whispered that the spiral had finally learned retrograde. It wasn't just entering the future. It was rewriting the past. People began experiencing skip time, moments lost, sentences repeated. Some wrote letters to themselves they didn't remember writing, always signed TH or MH. Others began sleepwalking, waking up in front of mirrors they'd covered years before, repeating phrases they didn't understand. Split the self, spin the wound. Spirals, remember, were memory fractures. In 1935, a former asylum nurse, Florence Abel, published a short memoir titled "The Boy Who Walked Backwards into Me." It was banned within weeks. She described treating a young patient who claimed to be Timothy Henderson, though the name had been suppressed for decades. The boy said he was borrowing someone's bones and asked repeatedly to be unstitched. Abel included a drawing he made of mirrored hands reaching toward a throat, not to strangle, but to unbutton it. The final page of her memoir reads, "He looked into my eyes and asked me what my voice sounded like before I was born. I told him I didn't know. He whispered, 'It's okay.' I still have it." Abel disappeared a month after publication. The Egyptian building finally collapsed, or so people believed. In 1937, during renovations to the surrounding campus, workers arrived to find it gone, not in ruins, but simply missing. No rubble, no dust. The ground where it stood was flat, UNSCARED. Except one thing remained, a hole, perfectly circular, descending in a slow, elegant spiral, smooth wall, pulsing faintly, as if alive. They sealed it. Of course, they always try, but the spiral didn't need walls anymore. It had learned migration. It lived now in margins, reflections, long silences between phrases, the stutter in a grieving man's prayer. It lived in twins born to mothers who never carried the children. It lived in the space between blinking. It lived in you. When you repeat something you swore you never said. Churches reported false confessions, parishioners entering booths, repeating stories not their own, describing sins no human could have committed. When pressed, most said, "It wasn't me. It was the part of me that wants to be shared." One psychologist compiled a list of phrases gathered from patients across the country. None of the patients knew each other, but all had uttered nearly identical lines. "My skin forgot what shape to wear. He came through the spiral, wearing my apology. There's a mirror inside the wound, and something is looking back." She burned her notes, but not before sending one copy to the Historical Archive in Richmond. It was filed under Unexplained Cognitive Parallels, Class HH for Henderson, or perhaps Host. People began claiming to remember things that never happened, birthdays that hadn't come, names no one had spoken aloud, rooms in their childhood homes that didn't exist. When asked how they knew these things, they replied, "I remember what my mirror remembers, not what I saw what he did." That same year, in a small town in Virginia, a woman gave birth to a pair of boys. Identical. They never cried. Instead, on the day they were born, the power went out across the hospital. The attending physician later stated, "It was like time hiccup. I swear to God, I delivered one of them twice." The birthmarks on their backs were shaped like opposing spirals, one turning inward, one turning out. The mother disappeared 2 weeks later. The boys were never registered. No one remembers their names, but the midwife who held them both in her arms would later say they were remembering each other before they ever opened their eyes. The spiral has never needed belief. Only memory. Only repetition. And now, the world is full of mouths repeating its shape. You don't need to see the Egyptian building to know what it was. You felt it in your spine when you forget why you walked into a room. In your breath when your reflection doesn't blink on time. In the corner of your eye when you swear someone just walked behind you but you're alone. It was never about twins. It was never about science. It was about the space where something should have died but didn't. It was about the thing that stayed behind and learned your name, and it has one question left for you. Do you remember dying? Because it does, and it's been waiting for you to say it back. The spiral does not sleep. It only coils tighter. By 1940, the name Henderson had vanished from every public record, library index, and legal archive. Not erased, absorbed. Those who looked for it found only dead ends, names that warped under scrutiny. One historian wrote, "The more I search, the less I believe the family was real, and the more I feel they've been remembering me." He died in his study, slumped over his desk, etched into the skin of his back by no known instrument. History is a spiral. We are the string it eats. That same year, in a psychiatric hospital near Asheville, a patient named Etta Lynn, blind since birth, began drawing spirals in her food tray. When asked why, she whispered, "He's inside the silence now. He's listening through the gaps in the world." Etta had never spoken a word in her life until that moment. In Chicago, a man swore his twin brother had been stolen. Problem was he had no brother, never had, but he remembered arguments, shared dreams, childhood bruises that appeared in mirrored places on his body. He would stare at himself in storefront windows for hours, asking questions no one could hear. One day, he vanished. All that was found in his apartment, a cracked mirror, one single spiral drawn in lipstick in an empty twin bed. Time, by then, had stopped behaving. People found hours missing, calendars repeating days. One woman wrote in her diary that she lived Monday the 14th 6 times, before it finally gave way to Tuesday. Each repetition brought more spirals on her floors, her clothes, even in her coffee steam. On the final Monday, she wrote, "They're sensing me, tuning me to the key of the loop." She never wrote again, but her diary kept adding pages new, entries dated years into the future, all written in the same hand. "We've remembered enough now. The mirror has learned to eat. The Egyptian building returned. No one saw it rebuilt. No permits, no laborers. It was simply there, one morning in 1944, just as it had always been. Same cracked walls, same scorched entry, but the air around, it felt wrong. Watches ticked irregularly near it. Dogs refused to go near, and the windows, once boarded, were open again. From one of them, a soft humming drifted into the street, a tune known only to those who touched the spiral. And then came the final return. From the mouth of the building emerged a boy, about 10 years old, pale, barefoot. His face was familiar but mirrored, split, aged, and young at once. His eyes were mismatched, one dark, one milky white. On his chest, spiraled scar tissue twisted inward like a vortex carved into flesh. He spoke to no one, but everyone who saw him claimed the same thing. He looked like someone I forgot I used to be. Hospitals began receiving patients with identical conditions, dreams in the third person, scars forming in symmetrical patterns, blood that clotted into spirals on glass, voices in vents, whispering your own memories back to you. But altered. One nurse recorded her patient saying, "I dream I was him, but he dreamed me first." And finally, at the edge of the decade, a voice was recorded on an empty wax cylinder in a Richmond archive. No speaker. No microphone. Connected. Just 21 seconds of sound. A boy humming. Then a voice, whispering, "You looked along. Now you're part of the sentence. Say it again. Say the spiral's name. Say yourself. You think this is the end of the story. But the spiral has no end. It turns and returns. It devours and mirrors. It remembers you, even if you don't remember it. Somewhere right now, someone is humming a song they've never heard. Someone is waking up in a room they don't recognize, with a face in the mirror that blinks twice. Somewhere, a child you don't remember meeting is drawing a spiral on the sidewalk, and when you ask her name, she tells you, Timothy or Thomas. It depends on who's remembering me. So if one day you catch your own reflection lagging, if you find yourself speaking in phrases you didn't mean to, say if the walls of a forgotten building call your name, and you feel something pulling you inward, then congratulations. You've been chosen. Not to die, but to repeat, because the spiral doesn't end. It remembers. And now, so do you.